A Small Town Wedding. Chapter 1. By Melinda Curtis. You're coming home, Vince. Deal with it. Vince Messina considered himself a survivor. He didn't think he'd survive his little brother's wedding back home in Harmony Valley. And that's what this conference phone call with his two brothers was all about. So much for you calling it a wedding invitation. The Texas summer sun beat down on Vince where he stood leaning against his truck, nearly as unbearable as his bittersweet memories of home. You're going to come to my wedding and stand on the altar with me. Younger brother Joe wasn't asking. And you're going to bring that girlfriend of yours. It's long past time we met her. Ah, the girlfriend. His brothers pestered him less when they thought he was in a relationship. Hence his make-believe girlfriend, the latest of which hadn't been make-believe a few weeks ago. Footsteps nearby drew Vince's gaze. He was part of a crew working on a huge remodel in a fancy neighborhood outside of Houston. And the blonde working the tile saw in the driveway. Harley O'Hannigan wasn't likely to go out with Vince again, much less go away with him. But she was just the kind of woman who could hold her own against his siblings. Yeah, my girlfriend isn't sure she can get off work, Vince hedged. What's her name? His older brother Gabe was nearly silenced by the whir of Harley's tile saw and the punch of a nail gun inside the house. And what's that noise? Where are you? They're remodeling my local Starbucks. Lying, Vince pulled his focus away from Harley. He hadn't told his brothers he no longer worked on an oil rig. And, no, I won't tell you her name. The last time I introduced you to my girlfriend, you stole her, Gabe. That was high school, Gabe scoffed. There is no girlfriend, Vince. Admit it. And that's the reason you need to come home so we can straighten out your life. Vince's life was fine as long as his brothers stayed out of it. Not that he didn't love them. He just didn't want to answer for every decision he'd made, every confidence he'd kept, every path he took in life. The fake girlfriend is your tell. Joe sounded disappointed. The last time you bluffed about one, you'd been clipped by a stray bullet in a bar fight. I wasn't actually in the bar fight. Vince had been collateral damage, which seemed to be the story of his life. He set his jaw. I'm not bluffing. There's a girl. Correction. A woman. Wearing worn blue jeans, a burgundy t-shirt with the construction company's logo and scuffed work boots. She wiped a tile dry with a towel, examining the cut she'd made in the white marble. Send us a picture, Joe prodded. We'll compare her to Sarah Whitfield. Did I tell you she was back in town? And still single? Guys, Vince squeezed the tail end of his patience, hanging on tight. There is no girlfriend. Gabe pounced once more. Which means you're in trouble. Do you need me to spot you some cash? No. Money was the last thing Vince was worried about. Harley spared Vince a glance. She was what Texans called a tall drink of water. Long, elegant lines, delicate bone structure, straight blonde hair that she kept in a long braid down her back. Everything about her appearance was at odds with her being a construction worker. That contradiction was the reason he'd asked her out. Her gentle humor and sly wit had kept him asking. If it's not money, how's that truck of yours running? Joe jumped in on Gabe's fun. I could rebore those heads again and you'd get another 50,000 miles. Vince drove their father's red and white 1976 pickup truck. It had a weak air conditioner, cloth seats and unreliable headlights. Dad had been a mechanic who'd struggled with mental illness, made harder on the family when Mom had left them. Despite challenges, Dad had taught his three boys his trade. Only Joe had followed in Dad's footsteps. Gabe was a lifer in the military, currently on leave for Joe's wedding. And Vince. Messina. Break time's over. Vince's boss rounded the far corner of the house they were remodeling. Jerry wore a frown and a sunburn from a weekend spent bass fishing. That deck's got to be finished today. Vince held up a hand, acknowledging the older man. I'm fine, Vince said into the phone. The truck is fine. My bank account is fine. Harley is fine. This last came out like a backfire through a rust-ridden muffler. His brothers crowed over his slip. Retire Dad's truck, Gabe said when he stopped laughing. I'll reserve you a room at the Lambridge bed and breakfast where I'm staying. Bring me some of that oil you dredge up on that rig of yours, Joe said, gasping for breath. Gas in California is expensive. And a girlfriend? Sarah is going to be so disappointed. Vince wasn't working on an oil rig, hadn't been for over a year since it had exploded. He wasn't retiring Dad's truck. Other than the faulty headlight wiring, it ran like a champ. He wasn't dating Harley, not since she'd broken up with him. And he had no idea if he was going to go to his brother's wedding. Harley O'Hannigan finished wiping the grout from the shower tile in the master bathroom and sat back to admire her effort. Carrara marble countertops. Chrome fixtures. White and black glass accents. It was luxury at its finest, not to mention it was bigger than the bedroom she'd had growing up and reminded her of the condo she used to rent in a high-rise downtown. That was 6 months and another lifetime ago. Harley. The male voice, deep and angry, reverberated off the walls in the empty house and shook Harley's stomach. She moved into the master bedroom where the summer afternoon heat was stifling. Most of the construction crew had left for the day and the air conditioning had been turned off by her boss. Vince was sanding the deck outside the bedroom's French doors. She wished he'd left, too. If he had, she'd have opened the French doors to get some airflow. Vince's broad shoulders flexed as he worked the sander. He looked so strong, so sturdy, so trustworthy. Harley shook her head. There's a mistake I won't repeat. Harley. Dan's voice was as hard as his footsteps on the wood floor. I know you're in here. Your truck is outside. I'm in the back, she called. And then so was her former boss, standing in the bedroom doorway. On first glance, Dan looked like any other young, hipster architect, the kind of man her brother would roll his eyes at, close-cropped blonde hair, neatly trimmed goatee, pink cotton, button-down and tight, white cigarette pants. He looked like the worst damage he could do was post a bad review online. But take a second look and you'd register cold gray eyes, an open-mouthed sneer, and fingers flexing into fists. You'd recognize a desperate snake ready to sink his fangs into vulnerable flesh. Fear stuck in Harley's throat. Why hadn't she seen Dan's reptilian side when he'd hired her, a fledgling architect, a year ago? Suddenly, she was glad Vince was still around. Your design can't be done, Dan said in an ominous voice that conjured images of cop dramas and crimes about to be committed. You knew this would happen. Yes, she choked out, hating that she sounded scared. And so did you. I told you not to do it. Not to steal her unfinished sketch. Not to present it to high-profile clients. Not to promise it could be built. He'd stolen more than her architectural plans. He'd stolen her joy in the work and her confidence in her abilities. Dan's brows dropped to the locked-and-loaded position. The structural engineers are demanding to see the plans from you. I put them off another 2 weeks, but that's it. Give the money back, Dan. He'd won an international design award with her conceptual drawings of a playhouse with balconies that seemed to float in the sky. And then the city of Houston had agreed to pay Dan millions to build it. Give it back. He choked on the words. His face reddened. I spent the advance on things like salaries and tuition reimbursement. For her. And on cars and a new house. An over-the-top place some other architect had designed. Dan had little talent of his own. He was drunk on new business and higher fees. As usual, her arguments fell on deaf ears. Dan made a guttural hiss, pacing in a circle. The fear in Harley's throat plummeted to her legs, weakening them. He'd never confronted her alone in an isolated place before. Every instinct she had urged her to run, to get out of the house and away from Dan. Before Harley had a chance to move, Dan did. He closed the distance between them and shoved her, hard. As she fell backward, Harley's vision tunneled until all she saw were angry, slitted eyes. She couldn't catch her breath. She was from a good home, a stable family. People in her world didn't get in physical fights. Despite the stifling heat, Harley felt cold from her head to her toes. She became aware of a scuffling noise. Someone might have shouted. Someone who sounded vaguely like Dan. Harley. Definitely not Dan's voice. She was incredibly thankful for whoever not Dan was. Warm hands engulfed hers, not the slightest bit vengeful. Harley. A gentle voice, one she should be able to identify if her head didn't feel like someone had stuffed it with thick insulation. You're safe. He's gone. She opened her eyes on a shuddering breath. A familiar face greeted her. Vince. They both worked for Jerry, remodeling houses. Vince. Friendly black eyes, a sturdy nose and black hair. That black hair. It had required a second glance when they'd first met. He had fantastic hair. The kind of hair Disney gave its princes. Her heart was racing for the exit and her hands had started to tremble in his. Vince's hands, not Dan's. Vince. He drove an old truck, not a new Ferrari. He'd offered her carrots once when he'd heard she'd forgotten her lunch on a remote job site. He'd bought her a drink after work one day, which had led to him buying her dinner, more than once, and then the infamous weekend away where he'd learned she'd quit being an architect. He hadn't understood why Harley had thrown away years of a college education, mostly because he was so floored by that fact that he hadn't let her explain. Note to self. I'm not safe with Vince, either. Hey. Vince gave her hands a gentle squeeze. Are you with me? With him? Harley would have followed him anywhere a few weeks ago, before the let me tell you what to do with your life debacle. Something crashed outside. Vince muttered what might have been an oath or a psalm. She couldn't hear over the pounding of her heart. He moved to sit next to Harley, tucking her beneath his arm, next to his bulky tool belt. Breathe in. Breathe out. Sounded easy enough, but that heart of hers was hammering against her lungs, making her pant. Vince holding her wasn't helping her recovery. Not that she moved away from him. Not 1 inch. Like this. Vince took Harley's hand and placed her palm on his sturdy chest. She could feel his heart beat nearly as fast as hers, but she could also feel him fill his lungs with air. Breathe in. Breathe out. Vince was big and warm and calm, and completely different than Dan. He'd never be a slave to fashion. He'd never take credit for someone else's work. He'd never put his hands on a woman with intent to do damage. In a distant part of her brain, somewhere where things weren't pounding, Harley's mother recited one of her Southern lectures. Life is hard, baby girl. You need to find yourself a big, strong man to lean on when times get tough. Finding big, strong men wasn't hard. It was finding the one she could lean on forever that eluded Harley. That's it, Vince reassured her. Vince was strong, too. He looked like he could play tight end for the Houston Texans. He smelled of fresh-cut wood and hard work. And he sounded the way Disney princes should, reliable, honorable, understanding. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Your hair lies, she murmured. It promised empathy and happily ever afters. She should never have broken the no-dating coworkers rule in her dating handbook. But Vince had that hair and that smile and that self-confidence slightly older men with their act together seemed to have. Are you dizzy? Nauseous? Bleeding? His fingers explored the back of her head and found. Ouch. She held her breath until the pain in the lump he'd touched passed. Give me a minute. Take as long as you need. She was afraid she'd take as long as he let her, which just wouldn't do. She was Harley O'Hannigan. The pride of Birmingham. Harley sighed and put some space between them. Thanks. My pleasure. She shot him with a sideways frown. I meant, Vince held up his hands, revealing scraped and bloodied knuckles. I haven't had a good fight in a while. He grinned. It was lopsided and devilish, and made her girlish fantasies flutter foolishly inside her chest. Mr. Carrots was a fighter. How had she not known this? I don't know him at all. You should press charges. A new sensation banged around her chest. Embarrassment. I can't afford the time off from work to fill out police reports or show up in court. What a flimsy fib. Which makes me sound practical. There he went, being nice again. This time it sent tears to her eyes. She didn't want his pity or his kind words. That would destroy the carefully constructed image she had of herself as the woman who can do anything. Which in hindsight was a lie, too. How about we call it a day? Vince stood and offered a hand to help her up, flashing that grin that had gotten her into trouble a few weeks ago. Pack your tools and let's get out of here. First beer's on me. Harley shook her throbbing head, pushing to her feet with the aid of the wall. Thanks for the offer, but we both know that's not happening. No worries. The grin disappeared and, just for a moment, she thought he looked disappointed. But we are getting out of here. Pack up your tools. I'll lock up. Agreeing with Vince that she'd finished for the day, Harley loaded her tools into a bucket and headed for the driveway where she'd left her tile saw. It had been hot inside the house, but it was hotter outside in the sun. It beat down on her head as if its goal was to melt her out of existence. Speaking of existence, the table she'd clamped the tile saw to had been appended. And dragged. And shoved half into the bushes. No. Oh, no. Harley's stomach fell and fell and fell, all the way to the pavement. Her bucket clattered next to it. She needed that saw to make a living. She righted the saw, which was still plugged in, and turned it on. It cocklunked a bunch of times and began smoking. She shut it off and stared at it, unable to move. That doesn't sound good. Vince approached her, carrying a bulky black tool bag. I wondered what all that racket was when he left. Dan. He smashed it. The same way he'd smashed her. There are two things a good man needs, Vince said slowly, epiphany-like. Pride and honor. This Dan has too much of one and none of the other. Harley nodded miserably. Vince peered at the saw. This is totaled. You sure you don't want to press charges against your boyfriend? A weight dropped on Harley's shoulders so hard and heavy she didn't correct Vince's presumption about Dan. Can't you fix it? By tomorrow when she had to tile the outdoor kitchen. Vince was always fixing something for Jerry, their boss. Vince set down his tool bag and examined her saw. See those dents in the casing? When it collapses like that, parts inside get damaged. I can't afford a new one. She'd gone from a starting architect's salary to a tiler's paycheck. And she'd just put a new truck transmission on her credit card. You can take it to that shop on Polk. They'll give you money for whatever parts they can salvage and apply it toward the purchase of a new one. She couldn't afford that either, not without a second job. Until then, she'd be cutting tile with a low-tech manual saw and nippers. Thanks for the advice. Demoralized, Harley released the base from the table and carried the dead saw to her truck, returning for her tool bucket and the work table. If only she could figure out how to make playhouse balconies float on air. Vince was still loading his stuff into his truck's lockbox when Harley opened the creaky door to her hot cab and climbed in. She missed her Lexus. She missed auto start and powerful air conditioning. She turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. Not so much as a tick of the starter. She missed reliability. Not today, she muttered. The truck was finicky. It didn't like to run during downpours or when the temperature dropped to the 30s. But the day had been hot and the skies clear. Come on, baby, she chided the old vehicle. Don't leave me stranded with Mr. Carrots and that grin. Vince locked up his tools and leaned on his truck, staring at hers. Still nothing. Her backside was growing damp with sweat. Vince came forward. He walked with the swagger of a man who knew what his purpose was in life. And, right now, that purpose was to rescue a damsel in distress. Pop the hood, he said. She did, hopping out and joining him at the grill. Not that she knew anything about engines. Her mechanical ability stopped at turning power tools off and on. Vince sked and gave Harley a look that teased and disapproved at the same time. Hey, don't judge, she said quickly. It runs. It's not running now. He drew a blue rag from his back pocket. It was the kind of scrap material mechanics used to wipe their hands and touch hot engines. You might want to spray your engine off every once in a while. He used the rag to check battery connections, hose connections, and to prod the engine compartment as if he knew what he was doing. Harley scoffed. I barely clean my apartment. Why would I clean my engine? So, a mechanic can see if you've got leaks anywhere, for one thing, Vince said straight-faced. Why don't you try it again? She hurried back behind the wheel. The truck started right up. Traitor, she accused under her breath. Vince shut the hood and came around to her window, wiping his hands. Thanks. Harley gave him her polite smile, the one she reserved for helpful sales clerks and the receptionist who squeezed her in at the doctor's office. I owe you. Yeah. He wound out the word and ran his fingers through that thatch of midnight hair. About that. I need a favor. Those kind black eyes lifted to her face. Don't believe in fairy tales. Don't believe in fairy tales. Despite their history, despite knowing better, silly fantasies about princely rescues and Mr. Right fluttered about her chest like happy butterflies on a warm spring day. She should go. Instead, she asked, what's the favor? The devilish grin returned, making the butterflies ecstatic. I need a date to my brother's wedding.